The opposition complained loudly, but they were laughed at and told that when the wild Prince of Wales became a great king, his first care was to get rid of his old companions. The jest might be a very good one, but by no means applicable, for the greatest characters in the empire were at the head of this opposition, and they were far from being Falstaffs or profligates of that kind. From that instant, they evinced a marked coolness towards the prince. Some would no longer see him, others refused his invitations or repelled the advances he made them. It is said, however, that one of them suffered himself to be persuaded to go to dine in private with the prince. The latter, recurring to his usual victorious weapons, endeavored to prove to him with his accustomed grace that he could not have acted differently, and at length desired to be told of what his old friends could justly accuse him. The guest, whose heart was still swelling with indignation, seized the opportunity and freely told him all his faults with such warmth that the Princess Charlotte, who was at table, was perhaps secretly inclined towards the guest's opinion, burst into tears. Lord Byron heard of this scene the next day and consecrated the event in these celebrated verses. Weep, daughter of a royal line, a sire's disgrace, a realm's decay. Ah, happy if each tear of thine could wash a father's fault away. Weep, for thy tears are virtue's tears, auspicious to these suffering isles, and be each drop in future years repaid thee by thy people's smiles. In 1814, at the time of my visit to London, I had the honor of being presented to the Prince of Wales at Carlton House. "And what the devil did you want there?" said the emperor. "I do not wonder that your majesty is surprised, but I was induced by a sort of point of honor. I thought I could do no other. There were many French at London at that time. I was the only one who had been near your majesty's person, worn your colors, and followed the line of conduct which seemed to be censured at that period, someone having told me that the others would certainly not endure my presence. That circumstance determined me to go. We were in fact 22 Frenchmen presented at the same time at one of the prince's grand levees. I must say that I never saw more graceful manners, more pleasing expression, more harmony in the tout ensemble. I thought him the beau ideal of elegance. I comprehended the full power, the whole truth of that magic fascination which I had so often heard attributed to him, and even at this moment, sire, when I recollect that fine countenance on which I thought I perceived elevation of mind, and the love and desire of glory, I cannot help asking myself how your majesty comes to be here, how these atrocious ministers could induce him to declare himself the jailer of the... My dear sire, said the emperor, perhaps you were no physiognomist. You took the halo of coquetry for that greatness, the study to please for the love of glory, and besides, the love of glory is not exactly in the face. It is in the recesses of the heart, and you did not search there. But were you not translating to me the other day, said the emperor, some journal or work in which it was stated that the prince regent had made a great display of sympathy towards the last Stuarts? That he had paid the most extravagant prices for things that had belonged to and been left by them, that he had talked of raising a monument to the last of them. There is much more calculation than magnanimity in all that. It is because he's anxious to establish and consecrate their extinction. From that event, his legitimacy and security date, and he is in the right. If in my time and under the circumstances into which the English ministers had plunged the nation, there had been some young Stuart of a brave and enterprising character equal to the present age, he would have been landed in Ireland, escorted by the modern doctrines, and then we should undoubtedly have seen the regenerate Stuarts driving out the blank Brunswicks. England would have had its 20th of March, such as thrones in their contagious influence. Scarcely is one seated there when the poison begins to operate. These Brunswicks, brought in by liberal ideas, raised by the will of the people, have scarcely ascended the throne when they grasp at arbitrary and despotic power. They must absolutely drive their wheels in the track which overturned the predecessors, and this because they are become kings. And it should seem that this is the inevitable course. That fine stem of the Nassaus, for example, whose patrons of noble independence in Europe, whose liberalism ought to be in their blood, and even in the marrow of their bones, those Nassaus who, as far as regards their dominions, would be only at the tail, and who might by their doctrines place themselves at the head, they have just been placed on the throne. Well, you will infallibly see them concern themselves about nothing but becoming what they call legitimates and adopt the principles, the proceedings, and the errors of that class. Nay, after all, my dear sir, has not the same thing been said of me myself? And perhaps now without some appearance of reason, for probably many circumstances may have escaped my observation, nevertheless I declared on a solemn occasion that in my estimation the sovereign power was not in the title nor in the throne of its splendor. It has been said of me that scarcely had I attained power when I exercised a despotic and arbitrary sway, but it was rather a dictatorship, and the circumstances of the times will be a sufficient excuse for me. I've also been reproached with having suffered myself to be intoxicated with pride at my alliance with the House of Austria, and having thought myself more truly a sovereign after my marriage. In fact, of having considered myself from that time as Alexander, become the son of a god. But can all this be just? Did I really fall into such errors? A young, handsome, agreeable woman fell to my lot. Was it inadmissible for me to testify some satisfaction? Could I not devote a few moments to her without incurring blame? Was I not to be allowed to abandon myself to a few hours of happiness? Was I required to use my wife ill from the first night, like the prince? Or was I, like the sultan we have read of, to have her head struck off in order to escape the reproaches of the multitude? No, my only fault is in that alliance was that of carrying too plebeian a heart with me. How often have I said that the heart of a statesman ought only to be in his head? Mine, unfortunately, in this instance, remained in its place, subject to family feelings, and this marriage ruined me. Because I believed above all things in the religion, the piety, the morality, and the honor of Francis I. He has cruelly deceived me. I am willing to believe he was himself deceived, and I forgive him with all my heart. But will history spare him if, however, blank? Here Napoleon was silent for a few moments, resting his head on one of his hands and resuming, "But what a romance is my life," said he, rising. "Open the door and let us walk." And we walked up and down the adjoining rooms for some time. Monday, July 1st to Thursday the 4th. Yesterday, my son's horse ran away with him whilst he was taking a ride, and being fearful the horse might dash him against the trees, he thought it best to throw himself off his back. He had sprained his foot sufficiently to condemn him to the sofa for a month. The emperor condescended to come into my room about 11 o'clock to learn the state of my son, whom he rated well for his awkwardness. I followed him into the garden where he breakfasted, which he had not done there for some time previously. The conversation turned on pillage by armies and the horrors occasioned by it. Pavia, the emperor said, was the only place he had ever given up to pillage. He had promised it to his soldiers for 24 hours, but after 3 hours, said he, I could bear no longer. I put an end to it. I had but 1,200 men, said he. The cries of the populace, which reached my ears, prevailed. If there had been 20,000 soldiers, their numbers would have drowned the complaints of the people, and I should have heard nothing of it. Happily, however, policy and morality are equally opposed to the system of pillage. I have meditated much on this subject and have often been urged to gratify my soldiers in this manner, but nothing is so certain to disorganize and completely ruin an army. A soldier loses all discipline as soon as he gets an opportunity to pillage, and if by pillage he enriches himself, he immediately becomes a bad soldier and will not fight. Besides, continued he, pillage is incompatible with our French manners. The hearts of our soldiers are not bad. When the first transport of fury is over, they come to themselves again. It would be impossible for French soldiers to pillage for 24 hours. Many of them would employ the latter part of the time in repairing the mischief they had done in the beginning. They afterwards reproach each other in their quarters with the excesses they have committed, and load with reprobation and contempt those whose conduct has been particularly odious. About 3 o'clock, the new admiral, Sir Pulteney Malcolm, and all his officers were presented to the emperor. The admiral first conversed with the emperor alone for nearly 2 hours. He must have been much impressed with this conversation, for he said as he came out that he had been taking a very fine and valuable lesson on the history of France. The emperor was understood to have said to him towards the close of the interview what I believe I have already introduced elsewhere on this subject. You have levied a contribution of 700 millions from France. I have imposed one of more than 10,000 millions on your country. You raised yours by your bayonets. I caused mine to be raised by your parliament. And that is the true summary of the matter, replied the admiral. The admiral was bringing from America some old troops consisting of 12,000 men without the least suspicion of the new state of Europe, At sea, a vessel informed him of the return of the emperor from the Isle of Elba, and the consequent revolution. It seemed to him so magical that he could scarce believe it. But when he arrived in sight of Plymouth, he received orders to proceed with all possible expedition to Ostend. He reached it in time, and 4,000 of the men on board his ships were enabled to take part in the battle, and they were unquestionably among the best troops in the whole line, as the admiral declared. Who can determine what degree of influence they may have had? The English thought the battle lost during the whole day, and they acknowledged that it would have been so but for Grouchy's error. After walking some time in the garden, the emperor got into his calash. The weather was delightful. We made 2 turns at full gallop. I was alone with him. He spoke much of my son and his future prospects with a degree of interest and kindness which went to my heart. He said that considering his age, the circumstance of being sent to St. Helena was of inestimable value to his future life, that it must be like a hothouse for bringing forward his character. After dinner, the emperor resumed the subject of the 18th Brumaire and related it to us with an infinite number of minor details, as he has long since dictated it to General Gourgaud. I shall refer to his publication for the mass of the particulars of this event. I shall only give here some little anecdotes or accessories which possibly may not be found there. Napoleon's situation on his return from Egypt was unprecedented. He had found himself immediately applied to by all parties and had been entrusted with all the secrets. There were 3 which were particularly distinct, the Ménage, of which General J was one of the leaders, the Moderates, directed by Sieyès, and the Rotten Party, with Barras at their head. The determination which Napoleon formed to ally himself with the Moderates exposed him, he said, to great danger. With the Jacobins, he would have risked nothing. They offered to name him dictator, but after conquering with them, observed the emperor, it would have been necessary almost immediately to conquer against them. A club cannot endure a permanent chief. It wants one for every successive passion. Now, to make use of a party one day in order to attack it in the next under whatever pretext it is done is still a piece of treachery. It was inconsistent with my principles. My dear sir, said the emperor to me at another moment, after having again run over the events of the 18th of Brumaire, that is a far different thing. You will allow from the conspiracy of Saint Réal, in which there is much more plotting and much less result. Ours was struck at a single blow. It is certain that there never was a great revolution which caused less inconvenience. It was so generally desired. It was accordingly crowned with universal applause. For my own part, all my share in the plot for effecting this change was confined to the assembling of the whole crowd of my visitors at the same hour in the morning and marching at their head to seize on power. It was from the threshold of my door, from the top of my own steps, and without my friends having any previous knowledge of my intentions, that I led them to this conquest. It was amidst the brilliant escort they formed, their lively joy and unanimous ardor, that I presented myself to the bar of the ancients to thank them for the dictatorship which they invested in me. Metaphysicians have disputed and will long dispute whether we did not violate the laws and whether we were not criminal, but these are mere abstractions and best fit for books and tribunes which ought to disappear before imperious necessity. One might as well blame a sailor for waste and destruction when he cuts away his mast to avoid being overset. The fact is that had it not been for us, country must have been lost, and we saved it. The authors and chief agents of that memorable state transaction may not, instead of denials and justifications, to answer their accusers proudly, like the Roman. We protest that we have saved a country. Come with us and return thanks to the gods. On the completion of the revolution of the 18th Brumaire, 3 provisional consuls were appointed, Napoleon, Sieyès, and Ducos. A president was to be chosen. The moment was critical and rendered the general highly necessary. He accordingly seized the armchair, and his 2 acolytes did not venture to dispute it with him. Besides, Ducos declared himself that moment once for all. The general alone could save them, he said. Thenceforth he was of his opinion in everything. Sieyès was greatly mortified, but he was obliged to do the same. Sieyès was a man of a very interested character. On the first meeting of the 3 consuls in council, and as soon as they were alone, Sieyès went in a mysterious manner to the doors of the apartment to see whether any person was within hearing. Then returning to Napoleon, he said to him with complacency and in an undertone, showing him at the same time a sort of cabinet, "Do you see that pretty piece of furniture? You do not perhaps suspect how valuable it is?" Napoleon thought he was directing his attention to some appendage of the crown which had perhaps been used by Louis XVI. "That is not the matter," said Sieyes, seeing his mistake. "I'm going to let you into the secret. It contains 800,000 francs!" And his eyes opened wide. In our directorial magistracy, we reflected that a director going out of office might very possibly go back to his family without a denier. A very unbecoming thing. We therefore invented this little chest from which we drew a sum for every director going out of office. There are now no more directors. We are therefore the possessors of the remainder. What shall we do with it? Napoleon, who had paid great attention and began at length to understand, said, "If it comes to my knowledge, the sum shall go to the public treasury. But if I should not hear of it, and I know nothing of it yet, you and Duco, being two old directors, can divide it between you. Only make haste, for tomorrow it might perhaps be too late." The colleagues did not wait to be told twice, observed the Empress. He as hastily undertook the operation, divided the spoil like the lion of the fable. He made several lots. He took one as the eldest director, another because he was now continued in office longer than his colleague, a third because he had suggested the idea of this happy change. In short, he adjusted 600 francs to himself and only sent 200,000 to poor Duco, who, in his first emotion had subsided, insisted on revising this calculation and seemed bent on quarreling with Sieyes. Both of them reverted to the subject every moment, wishing their third colleague to arbitrate between them, but the latter always replied, "Settle it between yourselves. Above all, be quiet, for if the matter should come to my ears, you would have to give up the whole." When we were about to fix on a constitution, said the Empress, Sieyes treated us with another very entertaining scene. Circumstances and public opinion had made him a sort of oracle in these matters. He accordingly unfolded his various propositions in the committees of the two councils with great mystery, importance, and method. They were all adopted, good, imperfect, or bad. Finally, he crowned the work by displaying the summit, which had been expected with lively and anxious impatience. He proposed a grand elector who was to reside at Versailles, to enjoy 6 millions per annum, to represent the national dignity, and to have no other functions than the nomination of two councils, one for peace and the other for war, entirely independent in their functions. Moreover, if this elector should make a bad choice, the Senate was to absorb him himself. This was a technical expression meaning to remove him by replacing him as a punishment in the crowd of private citizens. Napoleon, for want of experience in assemblies and also through a degree of circumspection which the circumstances of the moment required, had taken little or no share in what had preceded. But now, at this decisive point, he said, to laugh in Sieyes' face and to cut up all his metaphysical nonsense without mercy. Sieyes did not like to defend himself, said the Emperor, nor did he know how to do it. He made the attempt, however, saying that after all, a king was nothing more. Napoleon replied, but you take the abuse for the principle, the shadow for the body. How can you imagine, Mr. Sieyes, that a man of any talent or at least honor will resign himself to act the part of a pig fattening on a few millions? After this sally, which, said the Emperor, made those who were present laugh moderately, Sieyes remained overwhelmed. It was no longer in his power to resume the subject of his grand elector, and a first consul was determined on who was to have the supreme decision, and the nomination of all offices, with two accessory consuls who were to have deliberative voices only. It was, in fact, from that moment, a unity of power. The first consul is precisely the President of America, veiled under the forms which the irritable spirit of the time still rendered necessary. The Emperor accordingly said that his reign began in reality from that day. The Emperor in some measure regretted that Sieyes had not been nominated one of the consuls. Sieyes, who had first refused the appointment, afterwards regretted it himself, but not until it was too late. He had fallen into a mistake respecting the nature of these consuls, said Napoleon. He was fearful of mortification and of having the first consul to contend with at every step, which would have been the case if all the consuls had been equal. We should then have all been enemies, but the Constitution having made them subordinate, there was no room for the struggles of obstinacy, no cause of enmity, but 1,000 reasons for genuine unanimity. Sieyes discovered this, but too late. The emperor said he might have been very useful in council, better perhaps than the others, because he had occasionally novel and most luminous ideas, but that in other respects he was wholly unfit to govern. After all, said the emperor, in order to govern, it is necessary to be a military man. One can only rule in boots and spurs. Sieyes, without being fearful, was always in fear. His police spies disturbed his rest. At the Luxembourg, during the provisional consulate, he often awakened his colleague Napoleon and harassed him about the new plots, which he heard of every moment from his private police. But have they corrupted our guard? Napoleon used to say. No, they go back to bed. In war as in love, my dear sir, we must come to close quarters to conclude matters. It will be time enough to be alarmed when our 600 men are attacked. The emperor said that for the permanent government he had chosen in Cambyses and Lebrun, two distinguished characters, both prudent, moderate, and able, but of completely opposite principles. The one, the advocate of abuses, prejudices, old institutions, and the revival of honors and distinctions. The other, cold, austere, insensible, contending against all these ideas, yielding to them without illusion, and naturally falling into ideology. In resuming, he observed that Sieyes might perhaps have contributed to give a different color, another characteristic, to the imperial administration, but it was observed to him that this variation could not have been otherwise than injurious, for Napoleon's choice had been much approved of at the time. The men he had selected, it was said, were not liable to be objected to by Europe. They had greatly contributed to conciliate public opinion in France, which ran wholly against Sieyes. His name and the recollections attending it would, in the eyes of many people, have disgraced the acts in which he might have taken part, and there was an anecdote eagerly repeated at the time which shows all the ill will that was borne towards him. It was said that whilst he was talking with the emperor at the Tuileries about Louis XIV, he had suffered the word tyrant to escape him. Monsieur Abbé, the emperor was said to have replied, if Louis XVI had been a tyrant, you would now be saying Mass, and I should not be here. The emperor smiled at this anecdote without confirming or denying it. It will hereafter appear that it was false. Saturday, 6th through Monday, the 8th. I have not mentioned the governor for some time. We endeavored to keep him as much as possible out of our thoughts. We now scarcely ever reverted to him. His ill manners and the vexations we endured from him obliged me to notice him today. They seem to have increased. He has just withheld from us some letters from Europe, although they came open and in the most ostensible manner, merely because they had not passed through the hands of the Secretary of State, that considering that a want of formality can easily be rectified in England, but that it is irremediable at a distance of 2,000 leagues. If, however, in thus rigorously and literally fulfilling his instructions, he had only had the humanity to let us know that he has received these letters, and from whom they come, he might set our minds at ease with regard to those respecting whose health or attention to ourselves we suffer so much anxiety, but he has the barbarity to make a mystery of the affair. It is not many days since the Countess Bertrand, having written to town, he had the note seized and sent it back to her as having been written without his permission. He accompanied this insult with an official letter by which he prohibited us for the future from all written or even verbal communication with the inhabitants without submitting it to his approbation. And what is particularly absurd and incredible is that he imposed this restriction on our intercourse with people whom he nevertheless permits us to visit at our own pleasure. He accompanied the publication of the act relating to us with commentaries which spread terror amongst the inhabitants. He complains of the excessive expense of the emperor's table and insists on great reductions. It had not been understood that General Bonaparte would have so many people about him, ministers, he told us ingenuously, had never doubted, but that the permission they had sent us to go away would have induced us to quit the emperor. All this shuffling produced an exchange of pretty sharp notes to one of the governor's communications, in which he said that if the restrictions imposed on us ceased, to us too hard. We might relieve ourselves from them by going away. The emperor himself dictated the following addition to the answer we had already written, that having been uttered by him during his prosperity, we considered it our chief pleasure to serve him, now that he could do nothing for us. And if there were persons to whom this conduct was incomprehensible, so much the worse for them. Tuesday the 9th to Thursday the 11th, the governor continues to annoy us and is incessantly aggravating the misery of our situation. He seems resolved to place us in close confinement. He has published a proclamation in town ordering that all letters and notes addressed by us to the inhabitants on any occasion whatever shall be sent to him within 24 hours. He has also forbidden them to visit the Grand Marshal and his wife, who live at the entrance of our enclosure. In the beginning of this blockade of Madame Bertrand, it was so rigorously enforced that some medicine sent hence by the doctor for one of the Grand Marshal's people who was dying could not be delivered, and it was only by way of accommodation that the officer at last took upon him to let them pass over the wall. The governor, having read in a letter sent by one of us to Europe that the writer wanted several articles of clothing, linen, came and told him that he might have most of those articles out of the stores sent by the government for Napoleon, and the individual replied that he preferred purchasing them, being unwilling to incur any obligation. The governor dryly answered that he might pay for them if he had a fancy to do so, to which the other replied, "Excuse me, sir, I like to choose my shops myself." In consequence of this, the governor afterwards sent him word by the doctor that he should complain of him for having contemptuously refused the gifts of the government. The other instantly replied that he should be much obliged to him, being much happier to give him an opportunity of transmitting refusals and requests to the ministers he served. All these petty tricks, the length and interest of our readings, and the continuance of the bad weather, which is dreadful, increase the emperor's confinement to the house and affect him with melancholy. He now never stirs abroad. His amusement is now confined to going occasionally about 5 o'clock to visit Madame de Monttalon, who has not yet gone abroad since her lying in. We all meet there, and the emperor converses for half an hour or 3/4 before he returns to his own apartment. Today he met little Tristan, the eldest son of Madame de Monttalon, who is only 7 or 8 years old and runs about all day. The emperor placed him between his 2 knees and tried to make him recite some fables, of which the poor child did not understand 2 words out of 10. The emperor laughed heartily, blaming the practice of putting La Fontaine into the hands of children who cannot understand him, and began to explain these fables to Tristan, endeavoring to render their meaning more palpable to him. Nor could anything be more curious than the simplicity, justice, and logic of his illustrations. Whilst he was explaining the fable of the wolf and the lamb, it was extremely laughable to hear the poor child say, "Sire, and your majesty," and in speaking of the wolf and to the emperor, confuse all his expressions, whilst his ideas were probably in still greater confusion. The emperor thought this fable had far too much irony in it to be within the comprehension of children. It was likewise defective, he observed, in its principle and its morale. And this was the first time that he had been struck with these defects. It was false that the argument of the stronger was always the best. And if it sometimes happened so, in fact, that he said was the very evil, the abuse that was to be condemned, the wolf ought therefore to have been strangled in devouring the lamb. Tristan is very idle. He confessed to the emperor that he did not work every day. "Do you not eat every day?" said the emperor to him. "Yes, sire." "Well, then you ought to work every day. No one should eat who does not work." "Oh, if that be the case, I will work every day," said the child quickly. "Such is the influence of the belly," said the emperor, tapping down a little Tristan. "It is hunger that makes the world move. Come, my little man, if you are a good boy, we'll make a page of you." "But I won't be one," said Tristan, pouting and looking angry. Our afternoons were occupied in some piece of reading selected in hopes of enabling us to kill an hour or 2 of time. At this period, we were reading A Voyage to Spitzbergen, the shipwreck of the Dutch at Nova Zembla, the celebrated causes, the trial of Calais, those of Martin Guerre, and the Marchioness de Ranvilliers. The author observes in some part of the work that the face often gave a false idea of the character. The emperor paused, laid down the book, and said with a look and tone that denoted conviction, "It is most true, and it is also true, that no study will enable us to avoid this deception. How many proofs of this kind have I had? For instance, I had a person about me, his count is undoubtedly blank, but after all, he had a mischievous eye. I ought to have guessed something from that." He then went into some particulars of the character of the person in question. They had known each other from infancy, he said. He had long placed his entire confidence in this individual, who had talent and resources. The emperor even thought that he had been attached and faithful, but he was much too covetous. Talk about Bourrienne. Said he was too fond of money. When I was dictating to him, and he sometimes had to write millions, it was never without a peculiar change in countenance, a licking of his lips, and restlessness on his chair, which several times induced me to ask what ailed him. The emperor said this vice was too glaring to allow of his retaining this person about him, but that considering his other qualities, he ought perhaps to have contented himself with removing him into a different situation. Friday the 12th. The conversation today led us to speak of the Iron Mask, and we took a review of what has been said on the subject by Voltaire, Dutton, and others, and of what is found respecting him in Richelieu's Memoirs. In these, it is well known that he is said to have been the twin brother of Louis XIV, and the elder of the two. On this occasion, someone added that being employed in making out a pedigree, a person had come to him to demonstrate seriously to him that Napoleon was a lineal descendant from this Iron Mask, and consequently the legitimate heir of Louis XIII and Henry IV, in preference to Louis XIV on all his issue. The emperor also said that he had heard something about it, and added that the credulity of mankind and their love of the marvelous are so great that it would not have been difficult to make out and substantiate something of the kind for the multitude, and that there would not have been wanting certain persons in the Senate to sanction it. Probably, he observed, the very men who at a later period were so eager to revile him as soon as they saw him in adversity. We then went on to trace the foundation and the progress of this story. The name of the governor of the island of St. Marguerite, to whom the custody of the Iron Mask was entrusted, was Monsieur de Bonaparte. A circumstance, to begin with, very singular. This man, it was asserted, was aware of the origin of his prisoner. He had a daughter. She and the prisoner were both young. They saw each other and loved. The governor having informed the court of this circumstance, it was decided that there was no great objection to allowing the unfortunate captain to seek in love an alleviation of his misery, and they were married. The person who is speaking at this moment said that at the time the above particulars were related to him, he had been very much entertained by them, and had happened to say that he thought the story very ingeniously imagined, upon which the narrator of it had become excessively angry, maintaining that the marriage could very easily be verified by the registers of one of the parishes of Marseille, which he named. He added that the children born of this marriage were silently and secretly conveyed to Corsica, where the difference of language, chance, or perhaps intention had changed the name of Bonaparte to Bonaparte, and Bonaparte, which, after all, has the same meaning, and it's in fact the same thing. After this anecdote, it was added that at the time of the Revolution, a similar story had been made in favor of the Orleans branch. It was founded in a document found in the Bastille, and surmised that Anne of Austria, who was brought to bed after 23 years of sterility, had been delivered of a girl, and that Louis XIII, fearing she might have no more children, had been induced to put away that girl, and falsely to substitute in her stead a boy, which was Louis XIV. That the following year, however, the queen had been again brought to bed, and this time really of a boy, which boy was Philip, the head of the house of Orleans, who thus turned out to be, with his descendants, the legitimate heirs to the throne, whilst Louis XIV and his issue were only intruders and usurpers, according to that story. The Iron Mask was a girl. A pamphlet on this subject was circulated in the provinces at the time the Bastille was taken, but the story did not gain credit and very quickly disappeared without having, it seems, engaged the attention of the capital even for a moment.